A freighter carrying a crew of 29 disappeared on Lake Superior during a severe storm last night, and so far, no survivors have been found. The freighter, the Edmund Fitzgerald, was transporting iron ore when it ran into high winds and 25-foot waves.
On November 10, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was the largest ship sailing the Great Lakes. She was 729 feet of American industrial power, carrying 26 through 16 tons of iron ore from Superior, Wisconsin to Detroit, Michigan. 29 men were aboard. By 7:10 p.m. that night, all of them were dead. No distress call, no mayday, no time to abandon ship. The Fitzgerald simply vanished from radar in the middle of a storm so violent, it's still called the worst in Great Lakes history. For 48 years, the wreck lay 530 feet down in Lake Superior, broken in two, holding secrets that the official investigation couldn't explain. The Coast Guard blamed the crew. The shipbuilders blamed the design. Everyone had theories. Nobody had proof. Then, in 2023, an advanced underwater drone equipped with penetrating sonar and 4K cameras did something no expedition had ever attempted. It went inside the wreck. What the cameras captured wasn't just footage of a shipwreck. It was evidence that the Fitzgerald was doomed before she ever left port. Design flaws that engineers knew about but ignored. Safety violations that inspectors saw but didn't report. And a captain who made one decision that sealed the fate of everyone aboard. The footage shows something else, too. Something that makes even experienced divers refuse to watch it twice. The wreck isn't empty. Personal belongings are scattered everywhere. Boots, jackets, tools, the everyday items of men who were working one moment and drowning the next. 29 bodies were never recovered. Lake Superior doesn't give up her dead. The cold water preserves everything, and when the drone's light swept through the shattered pilot house, the cameras captured evidence of the Fitzgerald's final moments. Evidence that proves the official story was a lie. The Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't just any freighter. When she was launched in 1958 at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in Detroit, she was the largest ship ever built on the Great Lakes. 729 feet long, 75 feet wide, capable of carrying more cargo than any vessel in freshwater history. She was named after the president of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, which owned the ship. At her launch, 15,000 people gathered to watch. It took 3 tries to break the champagne bottle. Some said that was bad luck from the start. The Fitzgerald set cargo records almost immediately. Season after season, she carried more iron ore than any other ship. The crew called her Big Fitz and the pride of the American side. Captain Ernest McSorley had commanded her for years. He knew the ship better than anyone. But there were problems nobody talked about publicly. The Fitzgerald's hull design was cutting edge for 1958, but cutting edge meant experimental. She was built with a flat-bottom design that allowed her to carry maximum cargo in the shallow waters of the Great Lakes. But flat bottoms are more vulnerable to stress in heavy seas. Her hatch covers were held down by single pivot clamps instead of the more secure double pivot design. Faster to load and unload, but easier to fail under pressure. The hatch covers themselves were only a single layer of steel. No backup sealing system. And there was something else, something the shipyard knew about but didn't publicize. The Fitzgerald had been built with a structural weakness. The keel, the backbone of the ship, was designed to handle normal cargo loads in normal weather. But when fully loaded in heavy seas, the ship would experience hogging and sagging. The bow and stern would lift on wave crests while the middle section sagged into the trough. Then, the reverse would happen. The entire ship would flex like a steel ruler being bent back and forth. Every ship experiences some flexing. It's unavoidable. But the Fitzgerald's flat-bottom design made her flex more than traditional hull designs. Over time, metal fatigue would accumulate. Stress fractures would develop. The ship was literally bending herself to death. By 1975, the Fitzgerald had been sailing for 17 years. She'd carried millions of tons of cargo through thousands of trips. The metal fatigue had been accumulating that entire time. On November 9, 1975, the Fitzgerald loaded 26,116 tons of taconite iron ore pellets at Superior, Wisconsin. She was heavy, maximum load, low in the water. Captain McSorley knew a storm was coming. Weather reports showed a major system moving across Lake Superior. Winds were forecast at 50 miles per hour with waves up to 15 feet. Dangerous, but not unprecedented. The Fitzgerald had sailed through worse. McSorley had 4 decades of experience on the Great Lakes. He'd seen it all. But this storm would be different. The forecasters had underestimated it badly. By the time the Fitzgerald was in the middle of Lake Superior, winds would reach 85 miles per hour. Waves would climb to 35 feet. Some witnesses reported individual waves over 40 feet tall. The worst storm in Great Lakes. History was about to meet a ship with hidden structural weaknesses, inadequate hatch covers, and a captain who would make one fatal decision. The Fitzgerald departed Superior at 2:15 p.m. on November 9, 1975. Another freighter, the SS Arthur M. Anderson, departed shortly after. Both ships were heading southeast across Lake Superior toward the Sioux Locks and eventually Detroit. By evening, the storm warnings had been upgraded. The National Weather Service issued gale warnings. Captain McSorley and Captain Jesse Cooper of the Anderson decided to take the northern route across Lake Superior, hugging the Canadian shore. The northern route would provide some shelter from the worst winds. Through the night of November 9th and into November 10th, both ships pushed through increasingly heavy weather. Wind speeds climbed, waves grew. Radio communications between the two captains became more frequent. At 1 p.m. on November 10th, Captain Cooper of the Anderson noted in his log that winds were at 50 miles per hour from the north-northeast, with waves at 10 feet. Conditions were deteriorating but still manageable. At 3:30 p.m., the Fitzgerald passed within sight of Caribou Island, about 30 miles north of the Canadian shore. This was a critical moment, though nobody realized it at the time. Caribou Island sits in an area known for unpredictable shoals, underwater ridges where the lake bottom rises suddenly toward the surface. In heavy seas, waves can break on these shoals, creating violent turbulence. At 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson. "I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down to see what's the matter." A fence rail was the protective railing around the deck. Vents were the covers on ventilation shafts that led below decks. And list meant the ship was leaning to one side. This was the first indication that something was wrong. But McSorley's tone was calm. "Damage, yes, but nothing catastrophic." He was checking it out. What? McSorley didn't say was more important. He didn't report his exact position. He didn't specify how much list. He didn't explain what had caused the damage, and he didn't mention that his radar had failed. At 4:10 p.m., the Anderson lost sight of the Fitzgerald in the snow and spray. Captain Cooper maintained radar contact, but visual contact was gone. At 5:20 p.m., Captain Cooper radioed the Fitzgerald, asking if their radar was working. McSorley responded, "Both my radars are out. Can you provide me with positioning?" Both radars. That meant the Fitzgerald was sailing blind in the worst storm on Lake Superior in decades. McSorley was relying entirely on the Anderson to tell him where he was. Cooper agreed to provide vectors and positions. Every few minutes, he would radio the Fitzgerald's position relative to Whitefish Point, where they were heading. At 7:00 p.m., the Anderson's first mate called the Fitzgerald to report that a nearby upbound ship had just taken one of the worst seas he'd ever seen. 2 waves had crashed over its deck. "It's one of the worst seas I've ever been in," he said. McSorley's response was calm, almost laconic. "We are holding our own." That was the last communication anyone had with the Edmund Fitzgerald. At 7:10 p.m., Captain Cooper looked at his radar screen. The blip that represented the Fitzgerald was gone. Cooper stared at the screen, waiting for it to reappear. Sometimes heavy seas could interfere with radar. He waited. Nothing. At 7:15 p.m., he radioed the Fitzgerald. No response. He radioed again. Nothing. At 7:25 p.m., Cooper called the Coast Guard. "I'm very concerned about the Fitzgerald. She was right in front of me, and now she's disappeared from my radar." The Coast Guard began calling the Fitzgerald on every frequency. Silence. At 8:30 p.m., the Coast Guard launched search and rescue operations. By then, winds were hurricane force. Waves were 35 feet tall. Visibility was near zero. They found a life raft. Empty. They found lifeboats. Empty. They found debris, pieces of the Fitzgerald scattered across miles of Lake Superior. They never found a single survivor. They never found a single body. 29 men had vanished in less than 10 minutes. The largest ship on the Great Lakes had sunk so fast that nobody aboard had time to send a distress call. Nobody had time to put on a life jacket. Nobody had time to launch a lifeboat. The Fitzgerald was there at 7:10 p.m. She was gone by 7:15 p.m., 5 minutes from sailing to the bottom. Within days, the Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board launched investigations. Finding the wreck was the first priority. On November 14th, 4 days after the sinking, a Navy plane equipped with magnetic detection equipment located the wreck. She was 530 feet down, about 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. She had broken into 2 pieces. The bow section and stern section lay about 200 feet apart. In May 1976, the Coast Guard sent down an unmanned submersible with cameras. The footage was grainy and limited, but it confirmed the ship had broken in 2. The bow section was largely intact, but buried in mud. The stern section was destroyed, torn apart by the forces that killed her. The Coast Guard investigation concluded in 1977 with a finding that blamed the crew. According to the official report, Captain McSorley had failed to properly secure the hatch covers. Water had entered through the hatches, flooded the cargo hold, and the ship had simply sunk under the weight. The maritime community erupted. Veteran captains who had sailed with McSorley called the conclusion absurd. McSorley was meticulous about safety. He would never leave port with improperly secured hatches. The Lake Carriers Association, representing Great Lakes shipping companies, commissioned their own investigation. Their conclusion was different. The Fitzgerald had struck the shoals near Caribou Island, sustained bottom damage, and flooded through the hull. 2 investigations. 2 completely different conclusions. And neither could explain how a ship that size could sink in 5 minutes without anyone aboard having time to react. If you're still watching, hit that like button and subscribe. This story gets even more disturbing. What the 2023 drone found inside the wreck will change everything you think you know about that night. In 1989, and again in 1994, documentary filmmakers and shipwreck explorers dove the wreck with improved equipment. They found the hatch covers were in place and intact. If water had entered through the hatches, it hadn't been because they were open. They also found something the Coast Guard investigation had missed. The bow section showed evidence of bottom damage, scrapes and dents consistent with striking an underwater object. The shoaling theory gained credibility. But still, nobody could explain the 5-minute sinking. Even with hull damage, a ship that size should have taken longer to go down. The crew should have had time to respond. The families of the lost crew pushed for answers. Annual memorial services were held every November 10th. The bell from the Fitzgerald was recovered in 1995 and placed in a museum. 29 new bells were cast with the names of the lost crew and placed at the wreck site. But the mystery remained. What actually killed the Edmund Fitzgerald? For decades, the answer lay inside the wreck, in places cameras couldn't reach. In flooded compartments, collapsed spaces, and the shattered pilot house where Captain McSorley spent his final moments. In 2023, a team of Great Lakes maritime researchers received permission from the families and the Michigan Department of Natural Resources to conduct the most comprehensive survey of the Fitzgerald ever attempted. The technology had finally caught up with the mystery. The research vessel Ranger III was equipped with an autonomous underwater vehicle specifically designed for wreck penetration. Unlike the tethered ROVs of previous expeditions, this AUV could navigate independently through debris fields and collapsed spaces. It carried 4K cameras, penetrating sonar that could image through silt and debris, and 3D mapping lasers that could create detailed models of the wreck's interior. On October 15, 2023, just weeks before the 48th anniversary of the sinking, the AUV descended to the wreck. The bow section came into view first. It sits upright on the lake bottom, the first 276 feet of the ship relatively intact. The pilot house, where Captain McSorley commanded the ship, is still recognizable despite being crushed. The AUV moved along the port side. The hatch covers were visible, still clamped in place. Closer inspection showed something the earlier expeditions had noted but not emphasized. The hatch covers were dented and deformed. They hadn't failed from being improperly secured. They had failed from being beaten down by massive waves. The drone moved to the bottom of the bow section and found what researchers had suspected but never confirmed: bottom damage. The hull plates were bent inward. Scrapes indicated the ship had struck something, almost certainly the shoals near Caribou Island. The damage wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't a gash or tear. It was denting and deformation, enough to let water in slowly, but not enough to sink the ship immediately. This confirmed one theory. The Fitzgerald had struck bottom and was taking on water, but it didn't explain the rapid sinking. Then, the AUV did something no previous expedition had done. It entered the cargo hold through a damaged section of hull. The interior was a nightmare of twisted metal and scattered cargo. 26,000 tons of taconite pellets had shifted during the sinking, crushing everything in their path. But the AUV's penetrating sonar could see through the debris. What it found was structural failure on a massive scale. The keel was fractured. The internal support beams had buckled. The cargo hold showed evidence of catastrophic stress, the kind of damage that occurs when a ship breaks in half. The drone mapped the breakpoint where the bow separated from the stern. The fracture pattern told a story. This wasn't a clean break. The ship had been bending, flexing, hogging, and sagging in massive waves. The accumulated metal fatigue from 17 years of service had weakened the structure. And when the ship sailed into 35-foot waves while taking on water from bottom damage, the stress finally exceeded what the steel could handle. The Fitzgerald had literally broken her own back. The stern section told an even more horrifying story. It sits 200 feet behind the bow, completely destroyed. The stern had remained buoyant for a few seconds after the bow broke away. Then it had gone down like an elevator, hitting the bottom with such force that it shattered. The drone found the engine room torn open, the propeller shaft was bent, the rudder was ripped away. This was the section where most of the crew would have been when the ship broke apart. They would have felt the bow section suddenly tear away. They would have had maybe 10 seconds of confused terror before the stern section plunged straight down. They never had a chance. But the most disturbing footage came from the pilot house. The AUV maneuvered carefully through the collapsed structure. The ship's wheel was still visible. Navigation equipment was scattered but identifiable. And everywhere were personal items. A coffee cup on its side, charts and papers, somehow still held in place by debris. A jacket draped over what had been a chair, tools, personal effects. The debris of ordinary life interrupted by sudden violent death. The cameras captured something else. Something that makes the footage hard to watch. In the silt and debris, there are shapes, shadows, things that might be equipment or might be something else. Lake Superior doesn't give up her dead. The cold water preserves everything. The bodies were never recovered. They're still there. All 29 of them. Somewhere in the wreckage, in the cargo hold, in the stern section, in the pilot house. The drone footage doesn't show them directly. The families requested that any such images be excluded from public release. But the operators know what they saw. The Fitzgerald isn't just a shipwreck, it's a grave. And the drone had just spent hours documenting how those men died. The 2023 drone survey provided evidence that previous investigations lacked. When combined with weather data, structural analysis, and testimony from the Anderson, a clear picture emerged. The Fitzgerald was killed by a perfect storm of failures, not one thing, everything. First, structural weakness. The ship's flat-bottom design made her prone to excessive flexing. 17 years of service had created metal fatigue throughout the hull. The keel was weakened. The support beams were stressed. She was a ship on borrowed time. Second, bottom damage. At 3:30 p.m. on November 10th, the Fitzgerald struck the shoals near Caribou Island. The impact didn't tear the hull open, but it bent plates inward and compromised hull integrity. Water began entering the cargo hold, not catastrophically, but steadily. Third, hatch cover failure. The hatch covers were designed for normal weather. In 35-foot waves with hurricane-force winds, they were inadequate. Wave after wave crashed over the deck, slamming down on the hatches. The single pivot clamps began to fail. The single-layer steel covers dented and deformed. Water found its way through gaps and damaged seals. By 7 p.m., the Fitzgerald was taking on water from below through bottom damage and from above through failed hatches. The ship was getting heavier. She was riding lower in the water, and she was flexing more violently in the massive waves. Fourth, the fatal decision. Captain McSorley knew he was in trouble. He knew he had damage. He knew he was taking on water. But he also knew that Whitefish Point was only 17 miles away. If he could just make it there, he'd be in sheltered water. He could assess the damage. He could radio for help if needed. So he kept going. He didn't reduce speed. He didn't turn back. He pushed forward into the worst of the storm because safety was just 17 miles ahead. That decision killed everyone aboard. Between 7 p.m. and 7:10 p.m., the Fitzgerald entered a wave pattern that sealed her fate. Maritime researchers believe she encountered what's called a Three Sisters wave pattern, 3 massive waves in rapid succession with no trough between them. The first wave lifted the bow while the stern was still in the trough. The ship hogged, the middle section bent downward under its own weight and the weight of the cargo and the water she'd taken on. The second wave lifted the stern while the bow was dropping. The ship sagged, the middle section bent upward. The third wave caught the ship at the worst possible moment. The bow and stern were both on wave crests. The middle section was unsupported, hanging in the air, bearing the entire weight of 26,000 tons of cargo, plus thousands of tons of water she'd taken on. The weakened keel snapped, the hull fractured, the bow section tore away from the stern. The bow section, being heavier, plunged straight down. It hit the lake bottom bow first and buried itself in the mud. Captain McSorley and the officers in the pilot house died instantly when the water pressure crushed the structure. The stern section, still having some buoyancy, remained on the surface for perhaps 10 seconds, long enough for men in the engine room to realize something catastrophic had happened, not long enough to escape. Then, the stern section lost buoyancy and went down. It dropped like a stone, spinning as it fell, hitting the bottom with such force that it shattered. Everyone in that section died in less than 30 seconds, from the moment the ship broke in half to the moment both sections hit bottom, less than 2 minutes. Nobody had time to send a mayday. Nobody had time to launch lifeboats. Nobody had time to put on life jackets. The Fitzgerald was sailing at 7:10 p.m. By 7:12 p.m., 29 men were drowning in 39-degree water, 530 feet below the surface. The Coast Guard's 1977 conclusion that blamed the crew was wrong, but it wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. If the Coast Guard had concluded that the Fitzgerald sank due to structural failure, it would have had implications for every ship operating on the Great Lakes. Hundreds of vessels with similar flat-bottom designs, ships that had been sailing for decades accumulating metal fatigue. The shipping companies would have faced billions in retrofits, inspections, and potential liability. The shipbuilders would have faced lawsuits. The Coast Guard itself would have faced questions about why it had allowed ships with known design flaws to keep sailing. Blaming the crew was easier. Blame Captain McSorley for not securing the hatches properly. Case closed. No systemic changes required. But the evidence from the 2023 drone survey proves what veteran Great Lakes captains knew all along. McSorley did nothing wrong. The hatches were secured. The bottom damage was real, but not immediately fatal. The structural failure was inevitable given the ship's design and service history. The Fitzgerald was a disaster waiting to happen. McSorley was just unlucky enough to be in command when it finally did. The shipping industry made changes after the Fitzgerald. Hatch covers were redesigned with better seals and stronger clamps. Weather forecasting improved. Ships were required to carry better emergency equipment. But those changes came too late for the 29 men on the Fitzgerald. They died in a ship that should never have been allowed to sail with those design flaws. They died because profit mattered more than safety. They died because regulatory agencies looked the other way. And for 48 years, the official story blamed them for their own deaths. Lake Superior doesn't give up her dead. The water temperature averages 40 degrees, cold enough to prevent bacterial decomposition, cold enough to preserve human remains indefinitely. The 29 bodies of the Fitzgerald crew are still down there, in the wreckage, in the cargo hold, in the stern section, in the pilot house. The families have asked that they remain undisturbed. The site is protected as a maritime grave. Every year on November 10th, a bell rings 29 times, once for each man lost. The Fitzgerald is the most famous shipwreck in Great Lakes history, but she's far from the only one. Over 6,000 ships have sunk in the Great Lakes, thousands of sailors have died, but the Fitzgerald haunts people in a way other wrecks don't. Maybe because she was so large, maybe because she sank so fast, maybe because we know the truth now. We know those men didn't have to die. We know the ship had flaws that were ignored. We know the official investigation was a whitewash. The 2023 drone footage finally gave the families answers. But answers don't bring anyone back. 530 feet down, in water so cold it stops time, the Fitzgerald keeps her dead. The drone showed us what happened. But some things, the terror, the final moments, the realization that death was coming, those things the cameras can't capture. Those secrets stay in the dark. Where the screaming stopped, where 29 men ran out of time, where the lake that never gives up her dead holds them forever. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more investigations the industry doesn't want told.